Hello and welcome to the latest YouTube conversation from Catholic Concern for Animals. And we're delighted today to be talking to our very own scientific advisor, Richard Ryder, who, as you can see, given our economy cutbacks, is sharing a camera with our Chief Executive, Chris Fegan, at our trustees meeting this weekend. So we'll be talking to Richard about his career. Richard has been a long-standing advocate for animal welfare, far longer than I have been, and has had an eventful time in the process. Have you not, Richard?
I have.
One of the things which strikes me is that actually you started off as an animal researcher and then became an animal advocate. What was it that changed? What was it that started you on that process of changing your perspective?
I didn't choose to be an animal experimenter, but I found that in the undergraduate course at Cambridge for experimental psychology, I was exposed to a certain amount of animal experiments. weren't actually painful, but I saw and heard of other experiments that were very unpleasant. And that helped to make me feel that there was something seriously wrong. This is way back in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Early 60s. And at that time, there was no serious opposition to cruelty to animals. Animals were regarded as being quite different from human animals, that we were in two separate moral categories, and you could do to animals what you couldn't do to human animals. That's what most people thought. And so I felt that maybe there was something wrong with me when I felt myself feeling very concerned for the animals. And so for several years, I thought about the subject before I actually got involved with active demonstrations. But I did start writing a few letters to the newspapers during the early 1960s. And then I finally wrote a series of letters to the Daily Telegraph in 1969 that created a national stir in Britain. My letters were attacking animal experimentation, and it created a huge controversy. And I was supported by Bridget Brophy, who was a well-known author at the time, and she got in touch with me, and we actually did the first ever debate about animal rights ever shown on television anywhere in the world, I believe, in December 1969 on Scottish television. And she was a wonderful person, Bridget. She had already written something about animal rights. And together we did a number of programs broadcasting in the Open University in Britain, putting the philosophical case against abuse of animals. And I mean, I'd always been friends with animals. Some of my best friends, you could say, as a child, had been dogs and cats and other animals. And so I always felt that there was something seriously wrong with the way human beings treated other animals so badly in farming, in vivisection, in hunting, in blood sports generally. So I became more and more concerned about this, and really my patience evaporated in 1969, and I began to campaign actively against certain forms of blood sports and against cruel animal experiments. That's how I got into it.
Did you have a view then to having a career in animal advocacy of the kind that you've had since, or was it just something that you were doing as something separate from your main career at that time?
My main career was working in hospitals as a clinical psychologist at the time. I didn't plan to have a career in animal demonstrations or animal politics, you could say. Mm-hmm. That built and built and built. So it took some time before the issue took off. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the general opinion was one of ridicule, that if you began to speak up about animal cruelty, people tried to make jokes about you. They laughed at you. It was regarded as ridiculous and pathetic, and particularly silly for a man to do that. Women might do it, they thought, but not men. There was a lot of prejudice against not only animals, but against women as well. And that's why I coined the word speciesism in 1970, because I wanted to draw the parallel with racism and sexism, that it was an unpardonable prejudice to go on being cruel to animals and doing things to non-humans that we wouldn't dream of doing to human beings.
It's true, isn't it, that one of the key kind of responses to people who talk about animal welfare and nature and the environment generally is to put them down and to belittle them. You know, I mean, we have it with, you know, the tree huggers and all that kind of stuff. You know, it certainly was a lot more common back in the 60s and 70s. I grew up in the 70s and I remember that period, but it's still around today, isn't it? There's still an element of that kind of sneering tone for anybody who
still meet it occasionally. Yes, I think among the much older generation, they still have that attitude. I think the vast majority of younger people in Britain, for example, the whole attitude has changed now. They take animals seriously. They see animals as being like themselves, which they are, of course.
Yeah,
we're all animals anyway. Darwin told us that we're all animals too. And I just feel that Darwin's morality has finally begun to sink in, and people are accepting that the other animals suffer as we do, therefore deserve similar sorts of rights. Yes, it's a much better attitude today, but it's spreading around the world. For some reason, Britain started the modern ball rolling. It was in the 1970s and the late 1960s that things began to happen in Britain, which gradually spread to other countries and are now, I think, present in every part of the world. People are beginning to think for the first time seriously about their relationship with the other animals. And they're not letting species make a difference any more than race is a difference or gender is a difference.
Can you put your finger on what kind of elements you think have brought that change about?
Well, I think, you know, children naturally feel interested in animals, and most children actually like animals, and most children actually come to the right conclusion that animals are like us, and they should be treated as other individuals should be treated, because they have feelings, and they suffer pain and distress like we do. I think that has been the main change, that what I feel I've done, along with others, is to sort of liberate that natural feeling of fellowship and companionship with the animals that is often, or had been previously, suppressed in later life.
And going back to the 1970s, how influential and important for your development was the Oxford group?
Well, I started several years before they did. And it was very nice when Bridget Brophy introduced me to one or two of the young philosophers in Oxford who were beginning to think the same way as I was. I mean, I sort of formulated my ideas of painism, as I call it, which is an ethical view of the situation. when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge in 1960-63, and then started writing about it in letters to the newspapers during the 1960s. And then, thanks to Bridget, was introduced to other members of this Oxford group in about 1970-71. It was a great relief for me to find somebody else who thought as I did. But they didn't really influence me. I don't want to sound conceited, but I influenced them.
Mm-hmm. And again, one of the things which strikes me is that I think a number of people might look at you and look at your work, look at your writings, see them as theoretical and see you as very kind of, if you like, an academic person. But actually, you've been very involved in practical animal welfare through things like CCA and the RSPCA. How did that, I mean, did you see that as naturally going together, the theory and the practice, or was that something you just came into?
Yes, I felt very much that something had to be done about it. Mm-hmm. I felt slightly irritated by people who agreed with me, but then didn't do anything about it. I felt exasperated that people would say, yes, it is awful, but there's nothing we can do to stop this cruelty. And I thought, well, of course we can. So I started going to see members of parliament and writing letters to them and protesting against otter hunting, hare coursing, against cruel experiments, against factory farming, all these things, standing in the street and handing out leaflets and all that sort of thing, doing something about it and trying to get new legislation passed through Parliament, stopping it. And of course, although it took time to get going, we have been quite successful in achieving that. Something like 56 pieces of new legislation in Europe and the United Kingdom over the last 40 years, which is quite good going.
Yeah, it certainly has been a change, but I think many people would say, and certainly, you know, from the caseload of the RSPCA, we might say that animal cruelty is still out there, is still thriving. The attitudes of many people haven't changed. So although we've got a few more bits of legislation, are we really making a difference?
I think we certainly are, because, I mean, of course, you still, even though there are laws against one human being killing another human being, it still happens. You're not going to stop it all happening just by passing a few laws, but you're going to begin to stop it happening. And in many countries around the world now, standards of treatment of animals in laboratories is much better than it was. Levels of treatment of animals in intensive farming is better than it was. There have been improvements. Certain forms of blood sports like fox hunting in Britain have been banned against stiff opposition, admittedly, but they've been stopped and they are illegal now. So we can make progress. Of course, it takes time for every generation to accept things. There are still old members of the older generation who are against these developments, but the younger people tend to take a more enlightened view, I'm very pleased to say.
And the RSPCA and CCA might be seen as two rather contrasting organisations. Why are those two? Why are you attracted to those two in terms of working with them?
Well, I've worked 50 years with the RSPCA because the RSPCA is the biggest and the oldest and the most influential animal welfare organisation in the world. And because it was obviously not doing its job 50 years ago. It had been infiltrated by fox hunters and other people interested in animal abuse. And it was a question of joining it and trying to make it do better. So it's been a very rough time, really, of 50 years of fighting vested interests within the RSPCA. But I have to say, I've joined perhaps the CCA more or less by chance and been invited to be their scientific advisor. And I'm very honored to be so. But that was more or less accidental, I think. A very pleasant accident.
Yeah, well, pleasant for all of us. I mean, actually, I'll bring Chris in at this stage. Chris, I mean, Richard there is the scientific advisor to CCA. How much difference has he made? How much has he contributed to our organisation?
Absolutely enormous. I'm really, and I've said it many times, and I'm happy to say it now, even with him sitting next to me. I don't want to embarrass him, but I'll say it now. Having Richard as part of our team is one of the best things CCA has ever done. His experience, his knowledge, his support is invaluable to CCA as an organisation and to me as an individual in trying to lead the organisation. So one of the best pieces of work I ever did, asking him, and thankfully accepted to be CCA's scientific advisor. So I'm absolutely delighted. And as you said earlier, this is an unusual interview in that we're sitting side by side rather than the normal format we have. I'm really pleased because I'm sitting alongside one of the greats of the animal welfare, animal advocacy world, and one of the great theoreticians as well as practical advocates. So I'm absolutely delighted not only that he's sitting next to me now, but he's sitting along with CCA on our journey.
Well, I have to say it works well because CCA takes very much the political line. It tries to change the law to protect animals. And that's exactly the way I like to go.
What do you think of the kind of spread of debate about animal welfare in philosophy and politics nowadays? It certainly is a far bigger issue than it ever used to be. I mean, I remember when, Chris and I both attended university at the same time, and I remember then, animal welfare, animal rights on a politics course was very marginal. And it's become a much bigger issue now. I mean, what's your assessment of the kind of range of debate and the nature of the debate out there?
Well, the strange thing is that when I met these one or two individuals in Oxford that Bridget introduced me to, the whole subject of ethics, and particularly applied ethics, was rather in the doldrums. It wasn't doing very much. If you would ask the average bloke in the street what he thought about ethics, he wouldn't know what they were. And the strange thing is that such was the interest in animals and in cruelty to animals and what should be the right and proper way of treating animals, that it actually revived the whole subject of ethics. As you know, Peter Singer then joined in. He came along from Australia and to Oxford, where he heard about our movement and joined it, and other distinguished philosophers too. Tom Regan passed through Oxford at the same time. Mary Midgley was there, etc. So we actually, because of our debates about cruelty to animals and the rights of animals, we actually brought alive the whole subject of academic ethics. And it's now, of course, galloping away and doing very well.
Indeed, it is. And in terms of that debate, I mean, do you think that animal rights is in contrast to say, for example, the approach of Pope Francis in Laudato Si, which is this is a very poor way of putting it, but if you like, a lot more holistic approach. I mean, do you think that those two things contrast? Are they clashing or are they complementing each other?
Well, I think that Pope Francis has done wonderful things. And I think his attitude towards the environment and towards other animals is a tremendous step forward. It's very exciting to hear him attacking anthropocentrism and this sort of negative, prejudiced attitude towards the other species. So I think he's been a wonderful breath of fresh air and I'm tremendously supportive of what he's doing.
It seems to me as well that the nature of the problems we face as a human society are leading us more towards this concern for animals, but also for the creation, nature, as the environment in which we all as animals exist. And, you know, from things like climate change and biodiversity loss, the pandemics, which so clearly seem to be related to our treatment of animals, all of these things seem to be leading more in the direction of us changing our relationship with animals. Is that the way?
Yes, yes, I think so. I think our attitude is changing almost visibly. I can see it in Britain at the moment, the way in which almost everybody who speaks publicly now says something positive about animals, and people treat their pets really as members of the family. It's very heartening how the scales have fallen from their eyes and they're seeing other animals as suffering creatures like themselves. I mean, the only evil thing is causing pain unnecessarily to others. And there is now this great divide, not between human beings and other things in the universe, but between things that are conscious or sentient and things that are not conscious and sentient. And those who are sentient are all being lumped together on a more or less equivalent basis, so that X amount of pain to a dog or to a rabbit or even to a robot matters as much morally as X amount of pain to human beings. That, I think, is the important thing. We're being seen as more or less morally equivalent. Anything that is sentient, that has a capacity to experience pain or distress, matters more or less equally with each other.
That raises some interesting questions with respect to what's going on in Britain at the moment. I mean, a few months ago, we interviewed Lorraine Platt, who's the one of the originators of the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, about the changes in the Conservative Party. And of course, recently we've had the Sentience Bill, which has come along, and some have suggested that this is really down to a few individuals in the Conservative Party. It's not deeply seated. Do you think that whether or not the senior ranks of the Conservative Party buy into this, that if they are seen to ditch it, seen to drop it, that they will pay a political price for that?
I think they will pay the political price. I mean, the opinion polls very clearly demonstrate that in Britain, and indeed in many other countries now, there's a huge majority in support of the animals. 70%, sometimes 80% of the population say they want to see better protection for the animals across the board. Now, that's virtually unique among political issues. There aren't very many political issues where you can claim that 80% of the population are behind you. And that is the case. That is the case now with human beings. People are widening their sense of morality to include in all the sentient creatures, whether they're aliens, robots, elephants, hippopotamuses, beetles. If they suffer pain, then they are and should be the concern of governments. Governments should be concerned about creating legislation to protect all the sentients within their territories, not just human beings.
You focused in the conversation before on the importance of legislation, and as you say, there have been some tremendous changes in legislation, and you know, I think well, I won't go too far down this road, but I think it's very interesting with the leaving of the European Union in this country, the kind of differences which are now happening between ourselves and the rest of Europe. And it'll be very interesting to see where that goes and how that ends up. But isn't part of the problem, and again, I mean, I'd have thought this was very much kind of RSPCA territory, isn't really one of the problems here is that you can have as much legislation as you'd like, but if you haven't got the means and the resources to enforce it, then it's really not going to do you much good.
Yes, and we faced this problem 30 years ago in Europe. I set up something called Eurogroup, which is actually responsible now for some of the best reforms in the European Union. And yeah, you're going to better cut this. I've completely forgotten what the question was.
Well, the questions are unimportant, Richard. It's what you want to say which is important.
Talk about Eurogroup.
Oh, well, Eurogroup has done what perhaps individuals did in Britain. They've actually lobbied ministers, senior officials and others, and got something like 44 pieces of legislation through the European Union over the last 30 years, which is a remarkable achievement. And animals are much better off because of that.
Yeah, if I have to say, Gerald, on this again, I mean, Richard's role in setting up Eurogroup through the RSPCA, it was the RSPCA is the organisation, and Richard driving through that organisation to set up Eurogroup is one of the biggest practical achievements you were talking about earlier. Talk about the academic side and the philosophy and the painism and the ethics, but the practical development of Eurogroup, which Richard was singularly behind through the RSPCA this time he was there, is a huge legacy, in fact, to him, because Eurogroup has become, in my opinion, at least, the most important umbrella organisation for animal advocacy in the world. Now, clearly, it's mostly based in Europe, but it does have United States members and even members from Australia. But it's also now the drivers of Eurogroup, the current drivers of Eurogroup, and now it's just set up recently what's called the World Federation for Animals, which is a global organisation. But it's all this drive through the vision of Richard with the RSPCA to set up Eurogroup. And we're talking about in influencing legislation and politicians. CCA are very proud to actually currently chair the fish working group of Eurogroup. And we are working that fish working group on a big piece of work to develop a paper to present to the European Commission on fish welfare, which we're working our way through. And we will hopefully be able to hand that to the Commission in the next few months. And that we often talk about in CCA as fish to forgotten species. We've discussed that many times over the last year as we were working on this. That will take animal welfare even further with the consideration of fish and marine species to the European Commission. And again, hopefully these things don't happen overnight. It'll be a while before the Commission looks at that document and makes its recommendations and makes its proposal in response to that document, but it will happen and it will come. And that's all because of the vision that Richard and others from the RSPCA had in setting up Eurogroup all those years ago.
Well, it was thanks to the RSPCA that it had enough money to actually get Eurogroup going. And we gave the lion's share of support to Eurogroup for 15 years or more. So that was very fortunate. It was one reason why I got involved with the RSPCA, because it had huge sums of money. It wasn't always spending that money, I felt, on the most productive ways of reducing cruelty to animals, but they did on this occasion do very well.
Of course, I mean, one of the more recent things that Eurogroup has achieved is the success of its End of the Cage Age campaign, which was dramatically part of the AGM this year. And whilst running, I mean, just to mention our chapter on Fish the Forgotten Species, which should be out sometime soon. So just watch this space for books on that, folks.
Can I just say, Gerald, quickly, one of my very rare historical academic publications, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Of course. But it's rare for me to have anything of mine published in an academic publication, so I'm quite pleased about that.
Yeah, well, I think it turned out as a good chapter in the end, but we will see how the reviewers take it, Chris.
If I can just sort of say, I hope everybody seeing this program will think how they can join in to help the animals. They need to contact their politicians, particularly if they're elected politicians in a democracy. Write to them, make them aware of how much concern they feel for the cruel abuse of animals in their country. Try to get them to help, try to get them to improve the legislation in that country to protect animals. It's by writing letters to members of parliament that we've achieved so much in Northern Europe.
That was in fact going to be one of my questions upcoming to you, Richard. So while we're here, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because we're living in an age now, which again is very different from the age that was the case in the 1960s and 70s, where people are very disengaged from politics, very cynical about politics, even to the extent of not voting in elections, not participating at all, seeing it as something alien to them. And what is, if people now, you know, a lot of young people are concerned about these issues, what is the way that they should get engaged?
Well, I think it is a question of trying to contact their members of parliament, particularly in a democracy. When it comes to an election, go along and talk to your candidates before the election takes place and get them to agree to taking action if they're elected. Get them, prepare your questions in advance and then pin them down and get these candidates to agree. You'll find actually that an awful lot of them agree with you. An awful lot of members of parliament are not cynical people. They're people who actually want to try and help. And very often they will see that animals too need helping. The thing is to make sure that you tell them that your vote depends upon them doing something good for the animals.
That's a very good point, if I can come in there. One of the worries is this actual deliberate attempt to develop a cynicism about democratic politics, to say, well, all politicians are the same. They're all in it for themselves. They don't care. So why bother voting for them or engaging in the democratic process? Having spent some time in this world, seeing politicians of all parties, all shades of opinion, most of them, a vast majority of them, are in politics to try and improve society in whatever way they see it. They're not cynical money grabbers. There are obviously, like any bunch of people, some people who you trust less than others. But the majority of people who enter politics, wherever they are, whatever colour, whatever shade, believe in something and believe they're trying to make the world a better place.
I very much agree with Chris on that. Most of, you know, I've made friends with a lot of politicians. That's what I would say to people. Make friends with your politicians. Convince them that they can do something to help animals. Make friends with the media too, because they can help you.
Well, at the risk of sounding incredibly boring and agreeing with everyone, I mean, one of the things which just struck me about being a political science researcher was you go and talk to politicians at almost any level, and they are They're people who came into politics. They came into politics to change the world because they believed it was a positive thing to do. And I think it's one of the remarkable achievements of our political system is that we've taken these people and make them look like a bunch of money-grabbing, self-interested people. And it's just absolutely amazing that we've managed to achieve that in this country. And it's such a shame. It's such a tragedy for democracy. But there you go.
A nice place. Most of them are nice people, yeah.
Richard, to come back to you, I mean, you've gone through, these stages, as you said yourself. You developed the idea of speciesism, then coined the phrase, the word painism, now sentience. Are we not just drawing lines about what's acceptable animals and what's not acceptable animals? I mean, shouldn't we be saying that all of this matters, not just the bits which are a bit more like us than the other bits?
I think anything that can actually experience pain matters more than things in the universe that actually can't feel any pain.
Mm.
That's the crucial difference now. People are trying to find out what causes consciousness, what causes sentience. It's a very challenging scientific problem that faces science at the moment. We don't yet have any answers, but it is a mystery, this capacity to feel pain. And that's what makes something particularly important in the universe. If it can feel pain, it's my duty to try and reduce the pain it feels.
I think one of the interesting things about that, and which particularly hit me when we were looking at fish and the marine environment, is that some of the creatures which actually might be regarded as sentient, do experience pain, are actually not like us at all. You know, we tend to think that they have to be similar to us in some way. They have to have similar physiology to us in order to do this. But
Right.
it's not true. I mean,
octopuses, for example, don't look like us, and yet they're highly intelligent animals that suffer deeply. Lobsters, for example, and other crustacea, they don't look like us, and they have different sorts of brains.
Indeed.
They don't have it all concentrated in one place. The brain is separated through ganglia and so on. So it's a different arrangement, but it is still highly sensitive. The lobsters are still highly sensitive to pain. And the thought that thousands are put into boiling water every day and killed and boiled alive is an appalling thought. I would very much like to see the end to that.
Absolutely, yes. I'm not sure where I'll go with this now. You lost your train of thought already. I've lost my train of thought now. Where do you see yourself going now, Richard? What's the future for you in terms of your career? What would you like to end on?
Well, I would like to see, I mean, we've just been faced with a wonderful opportunity in Britain when the Conservative government is producing a number of possible reforms. It's a tremendous step forward for the Conservative government and will win it thousands of votes. There's no doubt about that. So I would like to see the conclusion of those reforms. There's about 6 of them in the pipeline. Actually, some of us, like myself, were involved in putting these ideas forward initially about 30 or 20 years ago. And it does take about 20 years, or maybe 15, to get pieces of legislation onto the statute book. I'd like to see, before I die, the completion of those reforms. Taken
together, those reforms are a remarkable set of changes, aren't they? I mean, probably greater than anything we've seen before, possibly anywhere in the world.
Yes, but you remember we've just gone through this very good period of 56 reforms since 1975.
Indeed.
1975 actually was a sort of key year in the history of the movement, because in Britain, the mass media suddenly changed its attitude towards animal cruelty. Up to that point, it had just made a joke of the subject. And as a result of some of the things that we were doing at the time, the newspapers and the radio and television began to realize that their audience actually agreed with us, and they didn't like the way in which the media were making jokes about the subject. And now we've got another great burst of, I mean, we got that 56 pieces of legislation through in 40 years. We've now got another, at least half a dozen crucial pieces coming through, and I'd like to see them completed over the next few years. And indeed, I'd like to see these new ideas spreading right across the world.
What's your assessment of that? I mean, because you have a view of this which most people don't have. As you said, I mean, Britain has actually been truly a world leader in this area, which actually not many politicians talk about. What are the prospects for these kind of ideas taking root and spreading into the Americas, through Europe, into Asia and Africa? Is that something we're going to see?
These sort of movements in ideas and in attitudes seem to surge forward and then slip back a bit, and surge forward again and slip back a bit. But overall, each time there is an advance. I think we've had a bit of a fall back at the beginning of the 21st century. From about the year 2000 or 2005 until now, there's been a bit of a slip back in Britain, not in all countries, but in Britain. And now it's beginning to surge forward again. And I think the Conservative Party will take the credit for that. And you mentioned some people who've probably been particularly responsible for getting the Conservative Party to realize how many votes they can gain from doing this. And the fact, hopefully, that it is morally the correct thing to be doing. I'm sure we're going to make some progress again. And as you say, it was fun enough Britain that started this particular moral ball rolling in the late 1960s. And I hope it's us that gives it another shove forward now. And I can see the results of that before I shuffle off the mortal coil.
And linking back to your practical work, because of course, another element of this, one of the reasons why these ideas are spreading and taking root, are these new international and global organizations, organizations like Eurogroup, the attention of the United Nations to these concerns, the creation of the World Federation for Animals. All of these are helping to take these ideas and spread them more widely. And of course, CCA sees itself as being a global organization because the Catholic community is global. How much is that developing those ideas? How much is that making a difference around the world?
Well, I think, of course, a lot depends upon the media. And the media like to go through phases too. They are for things for a few years and then they're against them and then they're for them again. And you've got to be patient and put up with these sort of rhythms of the media. I think at the moment the media are just about ready to have another supportive surge forward. And you mentioned the United Nations. That, I think, is one of the important reforms I'd like to see in the next few years. A United Nations convention to protect animals. We've got conventions for children, for women, for the human species, but at the moment there's nothing for the non-humans, the non-human sufferers in the world. They too should be recognized by the United Nations, and I hope they will be within the next few years.
Chris, have you got any last words to sum up, last things that you want to say in respect to this conversation?
Well, just on that note, one of the things that I'm very excited about is the creation of the new World Federation for Animals, and it will be designed to try and influence the United Nations, amongst others, And we've talked about how the United Kingdom was a leader in animal advocacy, and then that moved to Europe through Eurogroup, which has become a phenomenal organization for animal advocacy, Eurogroup for animals in Brussels. Now, the obviously next stage is the World Federation for Animals, taking that to a global stage where we can influence the United Nations, and through the United Nations, influence member nation states across the globe for animal advocacy. So you can see a progression here from the national to the European, now to the world global stage. Working with other partners, it's not only Eurogroup for Animals Europe, we have Asia for Animals, for example. We have organizations like FIAPO in India, all these being brought together under the umbrella of the World Federation for Animals, going to the United Nations, spreading the message there, to go into the member nation states throughout the globe. Very exciting, and I see this as a natural progression. Going back to Richard, he was part of all this journey, and hopefully he will live for quite a number of years yet to see the journey continue and get to that next stage, which I think is a very exciting project of the World Federation. And we're looking forward to playing our part in CCA inside that.
There's a lot still to be done.
Is there anything that you want to say to conclude, Richard?
Only that I think and hope that this is a worthwhile issue on which to devote some of one's hours and days of life on this planet, to show some respect for the sufferings of all creatures, regardless of their species.
Absolutely, and I think we would all like to say thank you for the hours and days that you have spent involved in this, Richard. And I couldn't agree more. This is every day makes these issues more relevant and more important to us as a species, whether you're self-interested or not, because without the survival of the creation that we have, then we will not survive either. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Chris. That's the end of this YouTube conversation with Richard Ryder. Our thanks to him for his time and for all his time through his career advocating for animals. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.